Eli Turner had long given up on miracles. Life, for him, had been a steady stream of breakdowns, cars and hearts alike, and the last 5 years had stripped him of nearly everything that once brought him joy, but he kept moving, because that's what men like him did, no matter how broken their bones or how burdened their backs. He was a man of grease and grit, with calloused hands and a soft heart that no one saw beneath the oil-stained overalls, and as he pushed himself to finish one last job. That chilly November morning, under the hood of a coughing '98 Impala whose owner had begged for a few more weeks to pay, he barely noticed the dizziness creeping in, the dull ache in his chest that whispered like a warning, until everything spun, his knees gave way, and the concrete rose up to meet him. The world dimmed and went silent, but not before a voice, faint and elegant, pierced the haze, shouting, "Someone help him, please." As heels clicked frantically across the pavement toward the crumpled form of a man who had nothing left to lose, Charlotte Avery, heiress to the Avery tech fortune, wasn't supposed to be on that street, not in that neighborhood, not with diamond studs in her ears and a designer coat draped across her shoulders, but she'd told her driver to take a detour that day. A detour from the boardrooms and banquets and business deals that felt more like cages than dreams, and something about the silence of that forgotten block had called to her, and now she was kneeling beside a stranger whose heartbeat was fading under her trembling fingers, her silk scarf brushing against motor oil and blood as she cried out, "Stay with me," not knowing who he was or why this moment suddenly mattered more than any gala ever had. The ambulance arrived minutes later, sirens wailing like a promise, and as they wheeled Eli away, Charlotte jumped into the back without thinking, ignoring the shocked looks of the paramedics and the angry calls from her assistant, because something in her gut said she couldn't walk away from this, not from him, not now, and so she stayed, through the ER chaos, through the diagnoses, through the discovery that the man was uninsured, unconscious, and dangerously close to never waking up. She paid for everything, refused interviews, dodged paparazzi, and sat quietly by his bedside, day after day, watching the rise and fall of his chest and wondering how someone so strong could be brought so low and how a world so rich could let men like him suffer unseen. When Eli finally opened his eyes, confused and groggy, the first thing he saw was a stranger, no, an angel. Sitting beside him, holding a cup of black coffee and smiling through eyes that looked like they'd known their own kind of sorrow, and though he tried to speak, she just shook her head and said, "It's okay, I've got you," words no one had said to him in years. In the days that followed, Charlotte learned about the man behind the broken body, a mechanic who'd once dreamed of opening a chain of family-run garages, who had a daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years because he couldn't afford to fight for custody, who had slept on a cot beside an old vending machine and ate one meal a day just to keep his shop running for the few loyal customers who still believed in him, and Eli, in turn, learned that Charlotte was not just a name from headlines or a face from fashion magazines. She was a woman who'd grown up in a glass house, where every smile was rehearsed and every decision made by committee, where wealth felt more like a prison than a privilege, and where her kindness had always been considered a liability. The more they talked, the more they saw each other, not the surface, not the scars, but the soul beneath, and though Eli hated owing anyone anything, he couldn't deny that without Charlotte, he wouldn't be alive. Still, when she asked what would happen to his shop, he looked away, ashamed, and said it was probably done, months behind on rent, tools stolen, reputation fading, but Charlotte only nodded and said, "Then we start again," as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and Eli, still weak, laughed bitterly and said, "You don't know what it's like, rebuilding from nothing," and Charlotte, eyes shining with something fierce and raw, whispered, "Don't I?" And that's how it began. Two people from opposite worlds joining hands not out of pity, but purpose, and walking back to Granger's auto shop together, past boarded windows and rusted signs, determined to breathe life into a place, and perhaps into each other. She used her contacts to source new tools, he used his to call in old favors, and together they scrubbed and sanded and rewired and rebuilt, often working late into the night with only the sound of jazz from an old radio and the crackling of a space heater to keep them company. The community watched with quiet curiosity as the heiress and the mechanic swept the floor side by side, and little by little, people started to return, not just customers, but neighbors, single moms who needed help, veterans who needed a warm place to sit, kids who needed someone to believe in them. And Charlotte, inspired by the strength she saw in Eli, started a free pantry in the back room and launched a pay-what-you-can-repair model that Eli thought was crazy until he saw how it lit up people's faces and reminded him of what real service looked like. News spread, slowly but surely, and soon the garage became a symbol of something more, of healing, of hope, of humanity. But not everyone was thrilled. Charlotte's father, Maxwell Avery, was furious when he saw the headlines, calling her reckless, accusing her of throwing away her legacy for a man with nothing to offer, and demanded she return home immediately to prepare for a corporate merger that would double their fortune. Charlotte flew home once, out of obligation, but stood in his marble foyer and told him the unthinkable, "I don't want more money. I want a life that means something," and when he scoffed, she handed him her trust documents and walked away, leaving behind a world of wealth for something more honest. Back at the shop, Eli tried to talk her out of it, feeling unworthy of the sacrifice, but Charlotte just smiled and said, "You saved me too, you just didn't know it," and together they kept building, turning the old garage into a hub of second chances, offering internships to troubled teens, fixing cars for free when no one else would, and hosting weekend block parties that brought music, food, and laughter to a neighborhood that had almost forgotten what joy felt like. Eli even reunited with his daughter, thanks to Charlotte's quiet support and a lawyer who took the case pro bono, and the first time she visited the shop and called him Dad again, Eli wept in the break room, shoulders shaking, while Charlotte stood silently by the door, letting him have that moment. They never labeled their bond, never tried to define it, because some connections are too deep for names. They just were partners, friends, something more, something real. And as the years passed, the shop flourished, not as a business, but as a beacon, proof that one act of compassion could ripple into 1,000, that wealth meant nothing without purpose, and that even the most unlikely people could change the world if they just believed in each other. And one golden evening, as the sun dipped low and the sound of laughter filled the air around Granger's, Eli turned to Charlotte and said, "Funny how life works. Huh?" And she grinned, wiping grease from her cheek, and replied, "You mean how a poor mechanic and a runaway heiress built something no one saw coming?" And Eli nodded, eyes misty, adding, "No, I mean how sometimes, when everything falls apart, it's just life making room for something better." And she squeezed his hand, knowing he was right, because this wasn't the life she'd planned or the one he'd hoped for, but it was better. It was real, it was theirs, and it was built not on money or status, but on the quiet, unwavering belief that kindness, when shared freely, can fix even the most broken things. Not just cars, not just hearts, but entire communities. And in that little garage on a forgotten street, surrounded by wrenches and warmth, love and second chances, they proved it, every single day.